In this episode, we turn our attention to land distribution and the economic analysis of sharecropping. First, to think about land distribution and the amount of inequality in the ownership and use of land. Just as we create Lorenz curves to examine income distribution, and more recently, as we've seen, education and health distribution, that is to say, inequality, we can do the same for distribution of holdings of farmland. So on the x-axis, we have the proportion of total holdings, measured as usually by going from the poorest to the richest, in this case, from the most land poor to the least land poor, how much farmland is in the farm, and on the y-axis, the cumulative proportion of the area of farming. This is in relation to area. It does not directly address quality of land. That may, of course, very much differ across farms. So here we have the proportion of farming, and these data are in decile increments. We can see some of the great variation here. We have our line of perfect equality of land holding. Here are two relatively equal cases, Japan and Taiwan. It's very difficult to get land reform going, to get a more even distribution of land. Both of these cases used to be far more unequal, but became more equal after World War II. In the case of Japan, it was under the US occupation, the MacArthur Regency, that decided that the country should have a more equitable distribution of farmland, as an example. At the opposite extreme, we have Latin American countries. We've talked about the traditional latifundio, minifundio kinds of systems in which there are many very small farms and a few very large farms. Here we have Brazil and Colombia representing that. These are older data, but nonetheless, this gives an idea. Along these lines, we can look at some distribution of land across different countries and then turn to look at types of farming on these various land holdings. We have a few countries from Asia and a few from Latin America in this perspective. We can see some of the farms that are very small, below 5 hectares, and some that are very large, above 50 hectares. So there's a great deal of variation. Many farms are quite small. Correspondingly, the Gini coefficient for land concentration can be quite high. It can range from a low in Asia of about 0.42, that's the case of Bangladesh. This is a case in which there are just not that many big farms, to a much higher Gini of 0.62 in the case of India. And many of the Latin American countries, as we just got a sense of from the land Lorenz curves, have a far higher level of inequality in land ownership, generally above 0.8, occasionally 0.9, or even a little bit higher. Among the farmland, the question is how much of the farmland, not number of farms, but how much of the farmland is under shared tenancy, or tenancy in general? How much is being rented in one way or another, farmed by someone other than the owner? And this varies significantly across countries. For example, in the case of India, it's about 10%, in the case of Bangladesh, about 20%, about a third in the case of the Philippines, and about 46% in Uruguay, in stark comparison with Venezuela at 2.4% and Costa Rica at 9%. Then among the tenanted land, among that land, how much is in sharecrop land? This varies quite a lot across countries, but it's as high as 91% of the tenanted land in Bangladesh. In Asia, one of the smallest is Thailand, but still at 29%. It's either not available in the data for some reason, or relatively smaller in general in the case of Latin America, although close to half in the case of Colombia. So what about sharecropping? It has a very long history of debate. Alfred Marshall was the first to point out that it is intrinsically inefficient because of its poor incentives. And what he had in mind, in simple terms, was this. We have labor on the x-axis, we have dollars per unit of labor on the y-axis, Here, as usual, we have the alternative wage. It's the wage we have to pay if we're hiring a farmhand, or it's the alternative wage that the farmer could get if instead of working on their farm, they did something else like work as a day laborer on someone else's farm, maybe run a micro enterprise. Here we have the value marginal product of labor in farming. We know that if we have family farming, that the amount of labor used, called LF here for L family-sized farm, would be found where that alternative wage was equal to value marginal product. That is what would be consistent with profit maximizing behavior. Of course, they may not use exactly this much labor under conditions of risk, for example, but this gives some benchmark to think about in comparison with the sharecropper. The sharecropper receives some fraction gamma of their output. That's the share tenancy contract. You get to rent the land, but instead of paying a fixed amount of rent, the rent is that you give some fraction of your output to the landowner. In this case, gamma is what the farmer keeps, and 1 minus gamma, the remainder, goes as part of the rental to the owner of the land. So that here's an unusually high case, 50-50 sharecropping is common. That looks like about 0.75 maybe. So this means that the farmer gets 0.75 of the output that they produce. A high gamma like 0.75 may mean that the farmer is also supplying as inputs to go along with the land seeds, fertilizer, and some other things perhaps as well. But here, even with this relatively high gamma of 0.75, the sharecropper is using significantly less labor than is the family farmer. They're using labor only to where the gamma of value marginal product of labor is equal to that alternative wage. That gives a labor used in sharecropping that can be significantly less in terms of what's efficient, what's best in the income perspective from the sharecropper in relation to the family farmer. So then there's a question, why do we see this even if it's inefficient? There was a traditional monitoring approach that said, well, this was what Alfred Marshall said, but that couldn't really be in market competition. So there must be some monitoring in which the landlord is able to observe what the tenant is doing and to make sure they're efficient. But the incentive still is there. Monitoring is costly, and there's no reason why the tenant would enter into an agreement that was against their interests. So, as a result, there have been some alternative arguments. A famous one is the screening argument. And this is the idea that the owner of land is offering 2 contracts to people, sharecropping or pure rental. And one reason that it's in their interest to offer these 2 contracts is because they get more money that way. They may have a relatively high pure rental fee, but they know that it's the high ability farmers that will take this. They wish the land were rented for less, but compared with the sharecropping alternative, they know they're a productive farmer, so they're better off and they'll take this. Whereas the farmers of low ability know things could go badly, they're averse to risk, they may choose the sharecropping contract instead. And so that's a very reasonable, a very fascinating way of describing this. There's some empirical evidence that the sharecropping is less efficient than the pure rental. It's really hard to prove this because land quality differs, and most important, most hard to observe, the ability of farmers indeed differs. But this one approach, Ali Shabam was the innovator here, is to say, well, we observed that there are many farmers who, for example, in India, farm on several different parcels of land. And sometimes the farmer owns a couple of these, maybe has a couple that are in pure rental, maybe even has a couple also that are in sharecropping. Or at least there's the case where they own a couple and a couple others they sharecrop. And so you're controlling for the same farmer, so it's the same amount of ability. And you're also able in this data to observe and control for the quality of soil and so on. And so in this, they found evidence that indeed sharecropping is inefficient. Maybe they weren't able to precisely test Marshall's approach, but they found less labor was certainly used, all other things constant, including the farmer himself or herself on the sharecropped land. Finally, Joe Stiglitz has introduced the explanation that has become the most common, which is that sharecropping is actually a compromise between two different kinds of risks. The first risk is to the landowner. If the landowner just pays the farmer, a wage like a farmhand, then there's incentive for the farmer to not work hard, to shirk, when they're not being monitored. But monitoring is necessary, and it's difficult because of the fact that you may have scattered plots of land. It can be quite costly to watch and monitor everyone. On the other hand, the worker would prefer this because a fixed and given known wage does not come with the same risks, clearly, of farming. But then again, we have the risks to the tenant. So the tenant might be asked to give a fixed rental amount. But that's very risky because you give up this rent, then it could turn out that you have a very bad year, such as a drought. So that's too risky. So sharecropping is a compromise between these two, argued Joe Stiglitz. Namely, compromise for the landowner and the tenant. For the landowner, there's at least some incentive, they'll work hard. And for the tenant, you'll know you'll get at least some net income or net food, even in a bad year, according to your share of the sharecropping contract. So we can explain sharecropping then as the best we can do under constraints. But it's important to note that does not make it inevitable or efficient. As Joe Stiglitz himself has really underlined, it's not that this is taking away the inefficiency that already Marshall had pointed to. Rather, it's saying something about the effects that can occur under conditions of extreme inequality in land distribution. So this is just one part of what makes the case for land reform as described in the textbook.